Welcome to the fifth episode of What in the Health with your co-hosts, Eric, Rena, and Fatiha. We're excited to present our fourth episode, Doing Your Own Research the Right Way. Today, we will be talking about the challenges regarding public health and medical research and how you can conduct your own research. Our guest expert for this episode is Dr. Bob Johnston, who is an associate professor of the Department of Biology at Johns Hopkins University. Aside from teaching undergrads and grad students, he also has his own research lab on campus where he explores the role of gene expression and cell development in fruit flies and human retinal organoids. In our conversation, we discuss what research is like from the perspective of a teacher, how you can begin to do your own research on topics that are important to you, how social media can impact research, and how issues in academia can be roadblocks in learning. We hope that this episode empowers you to feel comfortable doing your own health research while being aware of potential obstacles that may impact your understanding of a health topic.
To start, we first want to explore how the information we learn is influenced by the perspectives of teachers and professors. Here's how Bob described how he decides what resources and perspectives to look at before teaching.
So the key is to kind of, whenever one teaches a class, is not to get complacent, right? Is to always, maybe not every year, update things, but always keep the eyes on like, okay, this year, what do I want to update? So to try to alleviate any biases, I try to present different arguments or the state of the field. Often, it's not as much that there's two huge opinions about topics in science, as much as we just simply don't know the answer to certain questions. That's how I try to get around that issue of having any bias, by being very clear about what we currently know in the field and what we don't know.
Something that I've found really helpful is when professors provide context of the work that we're reading or learning from in whatever capacity they can. So for example, in a lot of my economics classes that I take, we have had a couple of readings and textbooks by, I only know this professor's last name, Mankiw. I don't know why I'm blanking on their name, actually. Let's look this up so I can give them credit. Yeah, so it's Dr. Gregory Mankiw, or also known as N. Gregory Mankiw, who has a bunch of textbooks published for macroeconomics, macroeconomic theory, and he's like a very well-known entity in economics. And almost every professor that I've had who uses Mankiw's work to teach will always talk about his political affiliations or beliefs or just general ideologies that may influence the way he explains certain concepts or biases. And I always find that so helpful because I think the context with which different learning pieces are written can really influence how they're conveyed. So it's just been a really helpful aspect of my college journey so far.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting discussion. Like, it comes up in philosophy a lot. Like, can you separate the philosopher from the philosophy, right? And I think obviously this is relevant to any discipline, including science, where we like to think everything's super objective, but everything's influenced by, the science is influenced by the scientist that does it in some way. Doesn't mean we can't trust it, but just means that context can be useful to interpreting it, like you're saying. And I like the way that Bob said that he provides context through like different viewpoints. I thought that was really interesting. Instead of kind of portraying some maybe controversial idea as just being a fact, which a professor could easily do and no one would know better, he likes to present kind of different opinions, so students can kind of look at them themselves and draw conclusions about it, which I thought was really interesting too, and super useful from our perspective.
Yeah, I like your point about how we expect science and medical research to be super objective and there's not perspectives in it. But I remember when I took organic chemistry here, what you learned was solely dependent on which professor you ended up getting. So one class would learn a whole bunch of stuff, whereas the other class didn't. And that happens a lot in a lot of science classes, humanities, and even like medical classes too. So I think that's really interesting. And then also I like Bob's point about how professors and teachers of a lot of these health topics need to know when to say that they don't know what the answer is. I think it can raise a lot of issues if professors are trying to put in their own answers, even if it's not supported, and that can lead to a lot of biases. So I appreciated that that's something that he does when he teaches.
Yeah. And I also think that kind of ties into how Bob said the key to whenever one teaches a class is to not get complacent. Right. And I think to me, not being complacent means having those pockets of, I don't really know this piece of information, or I'm going to open it up for the students to share their opinion or to have a discussion or to look and see what's been done since the last time I taught this class. I feel like it makes the content so much more engaging and fulfilling to learn, both as a student. But I know that that's a lot of work on the academic side too, is actually organizing those pockets.
Next, we will explore some issues found in academia that can get in the way of research and learning for the average person. Bob first discussed how many research articles are hidden behind paywall.
One thing that's been great in the scientific community is there's been a big push for open access to materials. And so there are literally journals that are called open access journals that allow anyone to read their materials. The very simplest thing you can do is email the author. They literally list the corresponding author, or you can just Google it or whatever. And you say, hey, I want to read your paper. And trust me, they will be very happy to send you their paper. The version now is to say, hey, I'm behind a firewall. I can't get access to that journal. Can you send me a PDF? And they'll do it.
Bob also mentioned how you should treat reviewed versus unreviewed information.
The field is moving extremely fast for the pandemic stuff. And a lot of papers are going out on what's called bioRxiv, which is essentially kind of like a journal, online journal, except that these papers are not reviewed. And so what that means is that it's the idea of it is to get science out quickly to the people. But that's the positive. The negative is that scientists have not reviewed it to know if it's good and trustworthy or not. And so that ultimately is if a paper is published in a real journal. So again, you have to leverage. If you read something in a preprint, okay, this is information, but it may not be completely accurate.
I understand the logic and the logistics behind including paywalls or having to pay for research articles, because you have to pay, at least I think, like the editors that are peer reviewing the paper, or the organization, or the publishing costs. Like there are all these costs involved, and I understand that. But also at the same time, from the student perspective, nothing bothers me more than when I'm looking for this paper that I need to include either in my work as a research assistant or as a student when I'm writing papers for classes. And I go into the library database to find this paper and we don't have access to it. And I'm like, oh, okay, well now I can't use this great source, or I don't know what gaps I'm missing now because I don't have this access to this one paper and can't afford to drop $40+ for one-time access to a paper. And it's always this tension that I have, and I never know how to talk about it in a nuanced way. So I'm glad that it's something Bob mentioned.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest problems is something we see in general media too, is like if you're a person who's looking to do research on a scientific topic and trying to figure out what's true and what's not true about this, you're going to do a Google search. Maybe one of these journal articles will come up. You're going to see it as a paywall. And then what are you going to do? You're going to start going to the free stuff, the less reliable stuff, the stuff that isn't from the source, right? Stuff that's interpreted, the stuff that's maybe misconstrued. And so because for whatever reason, this less reliable information is free, and reputable journal articles are not free, which, like you said, is understandable, people are going to turn to the free stuff. And this is kind of how we got in the situation we're in, where misinformation spreads pretty easily. Even good-natured people just trying to find the right answers can be easily misled or confused. And so, yeah, like you say, like it's an inconvenience, but it's also a big problem for society and public health as a whole.
Yeah, I know Bob had mentioned in his quote that the simplest thing is to just reach out to the author who published this paper and ask them very politely if you can get access to a PDF. That's actually something that I hadn't considered before, even though it seems really simple. But I don't know if this is just me being super jaded by just going through a bunch of databases for different classes, but I'm always wary of the likelihood of getting a response. Of course, because I've never tried this, I can't speak on it with too much authority, but I wonder, especially now, in a digital age where it's so quick to send an email and people's inboxes are constantly flooded, what are the chances that, you will get a timely response from this author with a PDF of this not free article?
Yeah, that's a great point. And thankfully Bob mentioned that a lot of these resources that you have to pay for become free at some point. So I guess if you need something right away, then you could try the email, but if you could wait a little bit, then you can get the free version at some point. But yeah, I agree. I can imagine it's very hard to reach out to these authors and get the information that you're looking for.
We at What in the Health are not telling you to go buy every research article that you come across, but I think that also opens up another can of worms, which is the fact that there's jargon in a lot of research articles, right? Like it takes a certain skill set to be able to process this information, which, we'll talk more in depth about how to actually understand a lot of the research papers that you read, but it also brings up the topic of knowing how to sift through different papers in academia, knowing what's reviewed and not reviewed, which is also something Bob had mentioned. And I think there have been multiple very controversial papers published over the past 30, 40, 50 years that I think really show us the need to understand the difference between peer-reviewed papers and unreviewed papers and how to extract information from it.
Yeah, and I think kind of the key message from that section is kind of like know when to take things with a grain of salt, and it's hard to do because, right, we're talking about like so many scientific topics can be literally life or death issues. Not knowing what to trust can be really scary, or feeling like you can't trust anything, right? You can't get, when we say a grain of salt, I mean like a grain of salt. We don't mean like, massive sugar cube, it's not ignore everything, don't trust anyone. It's just have some skepticism, say, hey, let me go through it. Let me see, does this make sense? Does this line up? Are multiple people agreeing with this? Like where can I kind of find truth in this? And it's hard. But like Bob was saying, there's some things you can do. You can say, has this been peer reviewed? You can kind of look into that. Maybe there's other types of research you can do, as we'll talk about in the rest of the podcast. But I think that's the general idea here, and that we'll keep coming back to as we keep going.
Something interesting Bob had brought up is that we asked him what he thinks about misinformation in research articles, and he said that he doesn't think there really is misinformation in research articles because of this review process. He mentioned that because papers are going through review through multiple people, that it wouldn't be published if it was misinformation. But I think that's really interesting because I've come across health articles that purely disagree with each other, and yet they're both published. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later, like how to decide what conclusions to make on your own if there are two sources that are going against each other. But I thought this was a really interesting point.
Yeah, even with like, this is kind of tangential, but the topic of like controversial papers that have come out, right? I think about the one that comes into mind is the very infamous paper where they conclude that vaccines cause autism, like the MMR vaccine for children. And it was published in the Lancet, I think, because the journal itself had been like, oh, you know what? This paper is actually not scientifically accurate. We don't want to promote this paper anymore. We're going to, we don't stand by it. And yet it had already reached so many people and so many politicians that they were able to use it for their own agenda and, fuel the anti-vax movement even more. Or there were papers, I don't remember, about like how healthcare professionals shouldn't dress a certain way, or papers about how medical racism doesn't exist, or, we're making a big deal about it. All these papers are constantly published, and often like they're redacted within a couple of weeks, a couple of months, because they're like, oh, actually what that wasn't a good idea to publish. But people within that time have already had access to it. And now you have a bunch more misinformed people. And that, I guess, just speaks to the capacity and speed with which we're just constantly pumping out content in academia, and how it can get really overwhelming really fast if you don't have the skill set necessary to actually process this information and develop your own thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure in the medical field to just publish as much as you can. And that push to publish really impacts how people interpret data, how they reach certain conclusions. So, yeah, I can imagine maybe that those papers were not reviewed in the best way possible, or maybe the researcher just wanted to get it out of the way. Like, those are a lot of factors that can go into the conclusions that are ultimately taken on by the readers. And so this is a very, very broad issue, and there's a lot of people at play. And yeah, it just takes a lot of work and practice, really reading through these papers and looking at these sources of information and realizing what you want to take away from them. Next, we want to focus on how social media plays a role in how we interpret research and health information. First, Bob gave us advice on how to handle polarizing information on social media.
With social media and all, I encourage people to watch out for this polarization. And then on the other side, to really think about what it means to interact with people on social media. Is it meaningful? Is it actually meaningful? Or are you just kind of feeding into the echo chamber? And then I would encourage people to do the really hard thing, which is kind of reach across the people that have other opinions and actively seek out and try to understand their opinion, not attack their opinion, but understand their opinion.
Next, we asked Bob on his opinion of medical influencers, who are key figures in the media giving health information to the general public.
There's a lot of podcasts and YouTube channels where there really are legit specialists that talk about topics. I would say that in general, those people are always going to exist, right? The people that quote unquote know everything about everything in medicine and science. And, often they're kind of just told what to say as part of the media presentation. I think what's exciting about the way things are going is that you're going to get to hear more from specialists.
Lastly, we asked Bob of his opinion on how to interact with people who have differing opinions about health information than you.
You can argue with a person, or you can try to listen and hang in there, and maybe throughout conversations over a long time, maybe those opinions can shift. So I would say for friends and family, again, it's really about reaching out and listening. We all think like if we shout a little louder, maybe that other person will change their mind. But really what will help, I think, is almost leading them. And sometimes I try to facilitate conversations the same way, especially about fiery topics like, what do you think this is? What do you think that is? In other words, I try to convince people by leading them to the way that I'm thinking about it.
In my opinion, this might be the most important part of this episode and of the interview, especially the part talking about how to interact with people. Because I think this is something that we're getting so bad at, is like talking to people that we disagree with, having a civil conversation, even when it may seem extreme to you, right? If you're going up to someone and they seem so deep into something that seems misinformed, so deep into something that seems like way too skeptical, way too conspiracy, we tend to brush people off, maybe think like they're not worth my time, or they're just crazy, they've lost it, they're down the loophole, they hate X group, blah blah blah. But I think we really need to. I think Bob gave this great story of him talking to his dad about political issues that they disagreed on, and how they, over the course of a few conversations, came to an agreement, and changed each other's views a little bit. And I think when we talk about things like polarization in society, this is a huge part of it, is the fact that we don't know how to discuss, how to argue, how to debate, how to come to conclusions, how to find common ground. And so I think really being able to approach someone who is misinformed with a charitable viewpoint and with an unassuming viewpoint, and just having a legitimate conversation about why they think that, why you think what you think, and kind of laying it all out there is just like so valuable. And even just one person at a time would do wonders for the current situation that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think that also brings up another point of knowing when to stop a conversation too, right? I feel like when you are talking to someone with a differing viewpoint than yourself, it's really easy to be like, I'm going to talk and talk and talk and talk until they finally subscribe to my view. And sometimes that's just not going to be the case, right? You could go in with a calm mindset. You can go in and do whatever it is to have a productive conversation on your end. And it might not go that way. And it's up to you to know when to stop and just move on, or find something else to do that will be a little bit more productive in helping them be misinformed, right? In fact, if you just keep going and going and going, it might just be more draining and actually end up being counterproductive.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think Bob made a good point about just trying to understand their opinion, not necessarily going into the conversation to change their mind or for you to change your mind, but just understand where they're coming from. And then at the end, it's up to you ultimately to decide if you agree or not and what to do about it. But yeah, this is a really fascinating topic because a lot of people learn through social media now. Like, you don't see people going on to, I don't know, what are some bio research or like medical research websites to find research papers. Like, that's not what people do first. They look on the news or they look on social media, whatever. And so this is becoming their first like segue into understanding health topics. And so, this is a really interesting and important point to talk about because, you're ultimately going to see something that you don't agree with. And it can be hard to facilitate conversations sometimes, especially with random people on the internet that you don't know.
We tend to think of social media as just like another way of connecting, right? And we think it's kind of analogous to other forms of connection. But it's not really this kind of public forum that we kind of think it is, where people love to cry like, oh, free speech, free speech. But like, that's not how social media works. And it's not how it's designed to work, because think about all the ways that, like, if you're a YouTube creator and you're making videos about public health and people are saying things in the comments that you don't want to, you can just delete them or like hide them or whatever feature that platform has, or downvote them to the bottom, whatever. And people won't see them, and they'll only see the comments that you want them to see. And that's like very dangerous in the wrong hands, right? Like, sure, it can be great in some ways, but it can also be very dangerous. And so again, it goes back to taking things with a grain of salt, but it's also just like, we need to be constantly self-critical. Like, what information am I taking in? Like, am I taking in information that is informative, trustworthy? Is it, like, am I looking up the person I'm listening to? Like, do I know anything about them and where they're coming from? And also, like, what I like to think of, almost feelings, not really feelings, but like, what outcomes am I getting out of this? Like, are watching these videos or taking in this content or reading these tweets, are these helping me be healthier? Are these fueling political rage? Are these fueling any other negative feelings, or are they like helping me? And so kind of thinking in that sense too. But I think a lot of just self-criticism will really help us kind of break out of these bubbles of thought that we often get ourselves into.
I think that's a great segue into Bob's discussion of medical influencers, because I feel like people are exposed to so much. And so they just think, oh, I'm going to follow this one guy or, these few doctors, and I'm going to get all my information from them, which is kind of scary because a lot of these influencers, they're there for entertainment. They're not there to treat your issues or to give you all the information about an issue. So yeah, I think the whole phenomenon of medical influencers, not just on social media, on TV too. Bob brought up Sanjay Gupta, he's the chief medical person on CNN, who talks about every medical issue like on that network. Like, so it's really interesting to think about how these people, aside from just random people on the internet, can influence your beliefs about health issues.
I don't know, something I have tried, spent hours of my life thinking through and trying to be as nuanced and objective as possible about, like, you know, these influencers are connecting with people and they're targeting misinformation and they're making content fun and trendy. And I've tried to play devil's advocate in my brain and have almost driven myself insane. But the bottom line is something about, like, just being a public health major. It hurts my heart when I see, like, a doctor or a healthcare professional upload a video about healthy eating, and then it's like advertised by like HelloFresh or like Walmart or Thrive Market or like one of these like just sponsorships. And I'm like, listen, you got to get the bag, right? I understand it's a business. It's a way to influence the public. I understand, but I feel like there's a time and a place, and something about leveraging your education, knowing that the majority of your audience isn't educated to that level to really understand the nuances of social media and partnerships and health information, really rubs me the wrong way. And, you know, there's this point of like, you know, they worked really hard for their medical education or their professional education. They should be able to do whatever they want with it and have like creative entrepreneurship ventures. And I'm like, yes, I get it. I'm like exhausting myself already. I get it. But it's, how is this not a form of exploitation? I just think it's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal, right? The title of doctor, the title of medical doctor is one that society places in extremely high regard. It's something that has to be taken seriously by the doctor, that responsibility that people are going to trust what you say almost blindly. And I think a lot of what you're saying like kind of goes back to this question of like, what is the point of being a doctor? Why are you a doctor? What is the purpose of a medical education, right? And I think a lot of, you know, the vague answer is like to help people, right? But that's kind of, at least for the purposes of this conversation, is like a useful summary of it. And that should be your mindset approaching social media, right? What's the purpose of you as a doctor having this social media account? Is it to help people, to inform people, to spread positive information? Or is it to get famous, to make money, like to do these things? And you can sense it as a viewer when you see it start shifting those priorities. And some people don't sense it. And then those people might get kind of lost in the sweep away, and kind of, instead of getting informative medical content, they start getting, you know, weird TikTok challenges. And it's like, okay, that's great. But now like you're kind of using your doctor title again in a way that maybe isn't ideal, and can even cause problems, like we're saying in some of these situations. But I mean, like you were saying with this stuff about critical thinking before, I think like this is something that we've talked about before too, is that like Bob here talks about the different types of medical influencers and how some are kind of very cool and trustworthy, and they're these cool specialists just talking about stuff on their own little YouTube channel. And it's hard to expect everyone to just know how to find those people and know how to ignore the other people, right? When we go online, if we're not familiar with health information, maybe we'll just pick the guy with the most followers because we assume that's trustworthy. Or maybe we don't know who to pick, so we just keep looking until we find someone we agree with or who seems good to us, but we don't know what our standards are. And so, you know, like you're saying, like critical thinking isn't, well, at least if you don't know a lot about medicine, it's going to be hard to pick out who you should follow for medical information online. And so, like, this is, I think, what you're getting at is like, maybe there are potential uses, but the fact that, like, you know, it can be misused is on its own very concerning. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important for these creators to make it clear to their audience from the beginning what their purpose is. And I really like Dr. Tony Yoon. You might know him. He's a plastic surgeon. And you can tell, like, from the beginning that he's there to entertain you. He's not there to lecture you about certain health issues or health topics. But if you are there to lecture people and then all of a sudden you're making random videos, it can be really confusing. So yeah, I think being a medical influencer, it seems very challenging, but it's important to be straight with your audience, what you're trying to do.
Being a medical influencer is kind of being sensitive to a lot of the issues you're talking about, and not, yes, becoming a pure form of entertainment while trying to act as though you're not, while trying to act as though you're actually presenting medical information. Yeah, like you're saying, I like the point that you're pointing out. The transparency is so important. That's what Rena was saying. But in the end, I found Bob's optimism toward the topic to be unexpected. The way he seemed so, we brought up the topic of like YouTube influencers to him, medical influencers, and he was like, yeah, I love watching all these specialists who I watch and my kids watch, and we watch these videos about neurology, or this guy talks about viruses and this guy talks about whatever, and it's like he's having a totally different experience than I think we're alluding to with the people we're talking about. So I think it's nice to have some optimism. I think, like Fatia is saying, there's reason to be wary about the situation altogether. Having celebrity doctors, is that even a good thing? But I like that Bob left us with some optimism. Wasn't really what I was expecting. But so if you are someone out there who's looking for digestible medical information, maybe keep looking, but dig a little harder, because I think what Bob was getting at is that these people who are doing good work and are giving good information tend to be more niche, tend to be more serious, a little less entertaining, tend to have fewer subscribers. So dig a little deep, and maybe you'll find some gold.
Now that we've discussed the current nature of research and misinformation, we now want to discuss how the average person can pursue doing their own research. First, here's what Bob recommended regarding how to find reliable and credible sources.
I highly encourage people to seek out scientific information at their level, right? Go on YouTube. Sometimes scientists give TED Talks. These are often kind of a little bit more generalized. So I would seek out that.
Next, here's what Bob said regarding how you can begin to reach your own conclusions based on the resources you've been exposed to.
So as you look through the stats, you kind of in part have to take, what people are showing for face value, right? In other words, like if they're saying this is statistically significant and they've done the proper statistical tests, then you have to kind of say, okay, this is what they've shown. But of course, if you want to go into it, you could reanalyze our data, but you're not going to want to do that for every single paper, right? So I would say, in my mind, one of the best things to do is to look to see if people present multiple approaches to address the same question, right? If they show it with multiple different approaches, then you can feel confident that their conclusion is correct.
Lastly, Bob recognized that scientific resources can be hard to understand and interpret, but like any skill, research takes practice.
Reading scientific papers can almost always be challenging, but it gets easier and easier the more you do it. It's just like anything else. And a lot of it is if you know the jargon, right? Because when you're just starting out, especially as an undergrad, it's almost like a different language. And you're reading words, and you have to very actively think about what maybe not every word, but like every 10th word, just what that word even means. As you read more papers, you're like, oh, okay, I recognize that gene name, I recognize that process name. It gets a bit easier, though I will say that reading papers is still challenging at times.
Something that I thought would be challenging in the eyes of most people is actually understanding what your level is. And we kind of alluded to this earlier when we were talking about critical thinking, but Bob said that you should seek out information at your level, right? But what if you don't know what your level is? And that kind of goes back to what we said about just looking stuff up on YouTube. Which video should I click on? Or which TED Talk should I listen to? Am I going to understand it? Like, I feel like relying on your own intuition can be pretty challenging, but I think it's a great piece of advice, because if you don't know anything about science and then you try to look something up on NCBI and you're like looking at all these graphs and figures, like that's overwhelming too. So yeah, I thought this was a great point.
I think his point about the fact that you can't just like reanalyze every paper you read, like you can't there's a reason there are research labs all across the country, each doing their own research, right? Because if one person tried to do all the research, they wouldn't actually get anywhere. You can't just reanalyze all this data. You can't just redo all the experiments, right? It doesn't make sense. And I think it's an important point because, like what you're saying, like we just have to kind of acknowledge our limitations. We have to recognize that, like, I'm not a scientist, and I don't know exactly what's going on here. And at the same time, we shouldn't blindly trust scientists, but we do need to enter. I think, like you're saying, like if you don't know what your level is, then your level is probably, if you're not doing an MD, then your level is, a certain level below that, like all of us. And we need to kind of approach it with a level of humility and say, let me look at what this guy's saying and kind of take their word for it, and then see if other people are agreeing and what other people are saying, other experts. And just like you're saying, you do have to kind of trust your gut. And again, you have to come at that with humility. You have to say, I'm going to try and use my best intuition here, but if it turns out to be wrong, I need to be able to recognize that too, and say, hey, okay, I'm realizing that my first conclusion isn't working out and isn't being proven. So I'm going to go back to the drawing board here. And so I really think humility goes a long way in kind of this process of doing your own research, coming to your own conclusions, and trying to find something that makes you feel confident in.
I also like the fact that, Bob mentioned you could practice reading research articles and doing your own research. And it's something that you will, slowly but surely get better at. And I think that those are really encouraging words to hear, because I remember the first time I read a paper from PubMed in high school, oh Lord, I was like, I'm not going to make it through college. I don't know what's going on. But, like Bob said, you start doing a little bit more research, you start reading a little bit more, you broaden your insights, you have a little bit more hindsight, and it does get just a little bit easier. And, for people who are not very familiar with very academic papers, we don't want them to be just so discouraged by it that, they never touch it again, because it's really valuable information. And there are some really cool papers out there for any and every topic and intersection and niche you could think of. So I like the fact that Bob was like, try again and try again and again.
Something that I learned when I was first reading papers is if you're just looking for something that's a general overview, then you can look for reviews. And reviews and articles are different things. So reviews are like, basically, it's just a summary of the whole topic, whereas articles and journals, those go really deep into specific topics. So I remember I'm in Bob's lab, and when I was trying to learn about something, he recommended to go look at the reviews. So if you're trying to get your foot in the door to a lot of these research articles, I would say look for those reviews. And then once you start recognizing the terminology or you start understanding the trends, that's a good time to get into more in-depth papers and resources out there.
I think overall, a lot of what Bob says here kind of reiterates the things we've been talking about throughout the episode. In general, looking for multiple sources that are saying the same thing is super useful, right? Like if you were trying to prove that autism causes vaccines, you only have one research article to point to, and you probably have a million others proving the opposite. So kind of looking for that repeat evidence. Like I was saying, bring that humility toward your research, look for your level. I think these are all key things. And recognizing our limitations, recognizing that this is hard, and it's much easier to just go to some guy who's going to tell you something that confirms something you want to hear, or it's easier to just go to some guy who's going to dumb it all down for you. But that really might not be what's best for you, for society, for all of us. And so there's work to be put in. And I think Bob exudes a lot of optimism throughout his interview with us. And so I hope you guys kind of take some of that away too, that this can be hard, but if you're someone who really does want to find truth for themselves, there's plenty of stuff out there for you. And with practice and time, you can do a lot of great research on your own.
We hope that this episode empowered you to understand aspects of research and misinformation and inspired you to learn ways to do your own research the right way. For more information about how to pursue your own health research, please visit our website withthepodcast.wordpress.com. To share your thoughts and interact with us, follow us on Instagram at with_the podcast. We appreciate your support. Thank you again to Dr. Bob Johnston for taking the time to talk with us. We hope you will join us for our next episode.